Good morning, everyone. When you think of quilting, your first thought is probably something like, oh, that's the stitching grandmothers do. Yes, some grandmothers do quilt, but it's not a requirement for the art form. Although quilting is not as prominent now as it was in other periods of time, it's still thriving in ways that might not be so evident. When I explored images of traditional quilts and art quilts, I learned that quilting involves improvisation, architecture, geometry, artistry, and stories. Quilting is storytelling with your hands. Every quilt holds the period of your life when you were designing, cutting, and stitching it. To really find out what quilting is, I had to talk to people, and once others knew what I was doing, they gave me books and supplies and told me their stories of quilting. Miss Volpe lent me a book, The Quilts of G's Bend, and looking through it, I was inspired by all of the detailed quilts. They each have so much character and uniqueness. The G's Bend quilts and other art quilts changed my whole idea of what quilting is and made me excited to see what I could create. I've always enjoyed making things with my hands, whether it's knitting, crocheting, or making 1,000 origami cranes. So quilting was a natural progression for me. The intricate skills of quilt making have been passed down from quilter to novice for a long time, and I joined that tradition when I found my mentor, Nancy Lan Hennig. A quilt is made up of 3 distinct parts: a top layer, which is usually decorative and pieced together, a middle layer called batting, which provides insulation, and the backing, which is generally one piece of fabric. And then there's a binding strip which goes around the quilt and frames it. The early history of quilting can be traced back to the quilted clothing found in Chinese tombs in the 7th century BCE. From there, quilting made its way down the Silk Road and into cultures all across the world, until it arrived on the shores of the New World with the first European settlers. For those pioneers, quilts were a utility item created out of necessity to keep families warm. But as the economy grew, some people became more affluent and were able to spend more time and money on quilting, elevating those quilts to fine heirlooms that were displayed as a sign of wealth. However, when the Industrial Revolution came with the innovation of mass-produced fabric, it caused the price to drop, making it affordable for everyone. This brought about new trends in quilting like repeated block patterns and crazy quilts. This shift changed quilting from an art of necessity into a predominantly creative one. Two of the most inspiring parts of the rich, complex history of quilting are its natural ability for community building, as well as enlightening people on social issues. Some people believe that 19th century quilts were used to pass messages in the Underground Railroad to help slaves escape. The markings and different signs held instructions indicating safe houses and routes to travel. While there are no written accounts, the secrecy needed for that system to endure may have caused it to be an unsolved mystery forever. In the early 20th century, women in the small town of Boykin, Alabama, better known as G's Bend, began producing quilts out of the rich traditions of African American quilting. When we look at the designs created in this secluded village, they appear to us now as beautiful pieces of modern art. Yet for those women, they were a unique expression of the improvisation that comes with limited resources. They described their quilts as providing a cushion against the hard realities of life. The originality and joyful asymmetry of these quilts immediately speak to those of us seeing them now, as they did when they were first discovered in the 1960s. Quilts have also been used to raise social awareness. For example, the AIDS quilt that was begun in 1987 as a 1,920 panel quilt grew through worldwide contributions into a more than 48,000 panel quilt weighing 54 tons. The quilt now travels around the world being displayed and is still being added to today. This project has helped to further a global understanding of the impact of the disease and created a memorial for those who have died from AIDS. Quilting is an art that teaches the quilter to see the potential in the odd-shaped scrap, the discarded or the worn, refining its purpose and raising it to beauty. It is the skill of recognizing how to see connections to fit unusual shapes together. It is a cousin to the activities of composting and recycling that also repurpose our resources, giving them new life. There is something so hopeful in these skills as they train us to know how to utilize everything around us to its full potential. When I decided quilting was my senior project, I had no idea what quilting was or what it would take to complete an entire quilt. But from the first moment, I was very excited about designing my own quilt and checked out a stack of books from the library. Sifting through them, I marked pages with designs that I wanted to try and recreate. One of the books I got was called 500 Art Quilts, and when looking through it, I saw this. It immediately caught my eye. I ran to get a piece of paper and started frantically sketching different ideas for my quilt. I soon had a picture of what I wanted my quilt to look like. I was intrigued by the possibility of creating a gradation of color as a background, with more free-form elements on top. The form soon turned into flowers, inspired by Miss Radefield's garden. Proportions of the vertical panels, and the size of squares that I wanted. At that point, I could have made my squares larger, as suggested by my mentor, because it would have been easier to complete, but I decided to go for the longer route and keep my 904 2-inch squares surrounding 5 vertical panels. My full-scale design was sketched to the finished square size of 2 inches, but to allow them to be sewn together, I had to add a seam allowance of 1/4 inch on all sides, which meant I had to calculate 2.5-inch squares. I hit my next hurdle while trying to find the colored fabric I wanted. The fabrics I got were not exactly the colors I imagined, but this is what I decided would finally work. After cutting out my panels and the estimated number of colors for the squares, I took a lot of time moving the colors around to find the color gradation I liked. The hardest part of my project was that I was not in full control of my work by using an electric sewing machine, as it felt like it had a life of its own on many occasions. Everything in my design depended on me being able to consistently sew a 1/4 inch seam, so that all the squares would line up to the panels. I wasn't sure how I would be able to train my hands and eyes to that level of exactness, but luckily it happened quicker than I thought. To prepare for sewing, I made little stacks for each column. Once the columns were sewed into strips, they were attached to the panels. It was during this process that I learned that I had to get my seams even, or else the squares really didn't line up to the panels. I was hoping for some magic, but that never happened. My earlier rows showed my learning curve and are a reminder of where I came from when I began. This process took me over 2 months to finish, and what a moment it was to see my last square. Now that I had finished the top of my quilt, I was ready to add the backing and backing. My mentor suggested I come to a quilting class with her to piece my quilt together. This is a group of women who have all been quilting for a long time. It provides a kind of early American moment like the quilting bee that still exists today, because you can come to class to piece together your quilt and everyone will help you. Once we started, many of the women came over and joined us, taping down the quilt, smoothing it out, and adhering the layers. While working, the women commented on my design and weighed in on the best way to quilt it together. The consensus was in the ditch, meaning in the seams. For me, that meant around my pants. Over the next week, I finished the quilting, which was very awkward because I had to sew with a lot of fabric hanging off the machine. I then cut out the binding and sewed it on one hand by machine, on one side by machine and the other side by hand. And throughout this whole process, I'd been doing test runs of my flowers, coloring them with block crayons, and trying out different petal shapes and sizes. I sewed an entire flower by hand, and saw how hard it was to make it flat while dealing with the curves. I realized I would need to take a different approach to attaching my flowers. Nancy suggested a technique of iron fusing, which I tried out and decided to work with. Each flower has about 36 petals, and I had to figure out a way to fuse them while keeping their position. Throughout this whole project, I was challenged to determine how I would get to the next step, jump over the hurdles, and proceed from an idea to reality. I was to learn that quilting was not only art, but relentless mathematics, improvisation, and necessary skill. There were so many times in this project when the only way forward was to jump without knowing if my choice was right. It was crazy to make the decision of having 2-inch squares because it made the sewing and seam matching time so much longer, but it was the right choice for me. I see now that quilts hold the history of time in which you are making them, and this is a chronicle of my senior year. I'd like to thank Nancy, my mentor, for all her guidance throughout the whole process, Ms. Christofides for helping me with my speech, Ms. Folke for showing me an amazing book, Kathy Lauer for supplying me with quilting tools, Ms. Radfeld for her inspirational garden, David and Tobias for doing tech for me, the Nielsen-Tadashuk family for always asking for quilting updates, my parents for all their help, and my class for being pretty cool.
Is this a quilt you're going to actually use, or is it decorative?
Is this the quilt that I will actually use, or is it decorative? Originally, I thought it would be decorative, but I think I'm going to use it. Yeah. Will I make another quilt? I think I will. Yes.
Was there anything frustrating about such a meticulous process?
Yeah, there were a lot of times, well, I'm pretty meticulous, but there were a lot of times when I was like, well, how am I going to do this? I don't know. But, yeah, there were times. The whole process was pretty intense. Yes.
Did the ironing really help you to make things sort of fit after they were stitched together?
Did the
pressing
ironing
help?
help to,
Straighten things
smooth
up?
it out and stuff? Yes, it did. There were a few places where I was like, oh no, it looks so bad, and then I ironed it, and I was like, okay, it looks a lot better. Yeah. So.
What was the most difficult point in the process for you that you really had to overcome from existing?
Well, I thought I was going to do my flowers by hand, like actually hand sew them. So when I realized I wasn't going to do that, it was a little bit annoying. Yeah. But
Have you thought about bringing your quilt to any quilting shows to share it with other people?
have I thought of bringing it to any quilting shows to share it? I don't think it's good enough to. But I don't know. Maybe. Yes.
About how many hours are we looking at? Did you keep track?
No, I didn't. Not really. But a lot. It took me about 45 minutes to an hour to sew in one strip, full strip.
That's after you cut them out, and
Yeah.
use the fabric.
So a lot of time. I didn't count right now. Yes.
Is this something where you see quilts in everything around you now?
Is this something where I see quilts in everything around me? Not really. I'm looking yet. Yes.
Did you ever want to change the design while you were doing that?
Did I ever want to change my design? Well, for the flowers, I kind of put them off until the very end because I was like, oh, I want these flowers, but I didn't really concretely design them until much later. So I was just floating around with that. So I was changing that throughout the whole process. But my design, I liked my design. Yes.
How did you come up with the color combinations that you finally chose to work in?
How did I come up with the color combination? Well, I knew I wanted some blues, so I just had to go to the fabric stores and just find what I could find. Okay, last question. Yes.
Which part was the most aggravating?
Well, I guess lining up my columns when I had to sew them together and they just weren't lining up. I was like, well, I was sewing it right. I'm not sure why it's lining up. So I had to take it out a few times. But yeah, well, not the whole quilt, just the one, the two strips.